So hi and welcome to this NPTEL course entitled Feminist Writings. We will begin with the final text, which is the final text of this particular course. And that happens to be The Remains of the Feast by Geetha Hariharan, which is a short story, right after we finish Shumpa Lahiri's A Temporary Matter. Now, one of the reasons why I chose this particular text for this course is that it is obviously the protagonist happens to be a woman, and then there are actually two protagonists, and there's a narrator. And the protagonist was a grandmother, the great-grandmother actually, was a dying old woman in a very conservative family. So that is obviously a very superficial reason why I chose this, but also it's a very important text about agency, about female agency, especially how it relates to the whole idea of space and how does one negotiate with one's agency, embodied agency in a particular space. And we've talked about already quite a few times across this course. We spoke about how identities are produced and reproduced according to different spatial negotiations. And so we look at the house over here, the home space where the great-grandmother lives, the dying, ailing great-grandmother lives, as a very, very discursive space which is mapped by certain discursive formations. And we see how the relationship between that particular space and the space of the bazaar, which is outside, gets negotiated. And also, interestingly, we find that food becomes a very important metaphor of this particular story, in this particular story. It becomes a metaphor of subversion, it becomes a metaphor of consumption, and it also becomes a metaphor of certain kind of agentic embodiment. So the whole idea of consuming certain kinds of food, it tends to take up certain aspirational qualities, certain agentically aspirational qualities, which is what we are going to trace in this particular story. So this is a story about memory, this is a story about food consumption, this is a story about female agency. And what's interesting is to see how all these themes get converged into each other in terms of making this a very complex text about feminist subversion, about female agency, about female aspiration in a particular space, etc. And also, one of the things which we need to be aware of when we read the story is the cultural setting of the story. It's a very, very typically a Tamil Brahminical setting. And that Tamil Brahminical setting is something which must be highlighted because that informs the decisions, that informs the inhibitions that the characters face in the story in terms of consuming certain kinds of food or not allowed to consume certain other kinds of food. So the dietary restrictions become very, very important over here in terms of the cultural setting. So that setting is something which we need to bear in mind quite carefully. So with that preamble, with that sort of thematic thing that we have in mind, let's dive into the text and see what the story offers in terms of the content of this particular course. So this is The Remains of the Feast by Geetha Hariharan. The room still smells of her, not as she did when she was dying. An overripe smell that clung to everything and had touched her. Sheets Zari's hands. She had been in a nursing home for only 10 days, but a bed sore grew like an angry red welt on her back. Her neck was a big hump, and she lay in the bed like a moody camel that would snap or bite at unpredictable intervals. The goitered lump, the familiar swelling that I had seen on her neck all my life, that I had stroked and teasingly pinched as a child, was now a cancer that spread like a fire down her whole body, licking clean everything in its way. So we find that the descriptions at the very beginning are very visceral in quality. So obviously the reference over here is to a very old woman, to a diseased woman, someone who has several diseases in her body. And then the animal metaphor is also interesting, the animal analogy of a moody camel who would snap or bite unpredictably happens to become a very important image in this point of time. And the lump, which has now become a cancer, we are told it travels from being a familiar swelling, which was playfully used, playfully touched by the protagonist, into something which is a cancer, a life-taking cancer, which is now spreading down the whole body, licking clean everything in its way. So cancer becomes an image of movement, an image of consumption over here. So it's something which consumes the body, it's something which takes away the body, the cellular agency of the body. And that's something which is highlighted at the very beginning of the story. The room now smells like a press-faded rose, a dry, elusive smell, burned, a candle put out. We're not exactly roommates, but we share two rooms, one corner of the old ancestral house, all my 20-year-old life. So you find a very interesting empathy or empathetic bond which is established between the protagonist and her great-grandmother. And it's very important, it's interesting to look at these two female characters in the story because the protagonist, we are told, is studying to be a doctor, presumably somewhere in Tamil Nadu, because the setting over here is very, very Brahminical Tamil setting. And the great-grandmother happens to be a diseased woman, someone who is obviously dying, but there seems to be some kind of an aspirational connection or an empathetic connection in terms of aspiration between the two characters over here. Because we are told that they almost become roommates, almost become friends, despite the massive difference in the age, despite the massive difference in the cultural exposure, etc. And what we should be very careful about while reading the story is the spatial dimension which is described in the story in terms of the different configurations, the different mappings of spaces which take place, the different discursive mappings. And as we know by now, I think space is a very discursive quality. And the discursive quality of space and the corporeal quality of the body are often entangled with each other in very complex ways. And that complex entanglement is something which we have studied throughout this course, whether it's the Yellow Wallpaper or the Iraqi Nights by Dunya Mikhail, or of course theoretically when it comes to someone like Judith Butler, there too we have this entanglement between corporeality and discursivity. And now we are told, we're given the details about the character in terms of age, in terms of who she is. She was Rukmini, my great-grandmother. She was 90 when she died last month, outliving by 10 years her only son and daughter-in-law. I don't know how she felt then, but later she seemed to find something slightly hilarious about it all, that she, an ignorant, village-bred woman who signed the papers my father brought her with a thumbprint, should survive, while they, city-bred, ambitious, should collapse their weak hearts and arthritic knees at the first sign of old age. So we're told, we're given descriptions about her age, we're given descriptions about who she is, and we're told that she's a 90-year-old woman who died last month, who outlived most of her relatives who are significantly younger than she is. And we're also told, and this is a dark humorous quality in the story, that we're also told that there seemed to be a degree of funniness, a degree of hilarious quality, the acceptance and knowledge that she had outlived all these people, and the people who died before her were city-bred, grew up presumably in more sophisticated and more privileged upbringing, in more privileged settings, ambitious, whereas she is ignorant. She's someone who is assigned with a thumbprint. Any piece of paper was given to her without reading it because she was ignorant, and she just signed it with a thumbprint, and she grew up in a village, but then she happened to outlive most of the people who died before her, most of her relatives. Her sense of humor was always quaint. It could also be embarrassing. She would sit in her corner, her round plump face reddening, giggling like a little girl. So again, this relationship between, this connect between the very old senile woman and a little girl is interesting, because this degree of senility, as it were, or dementia, makes her as unpredictable or as sort of messy or as anarchic as a little girl. She doesn't really have rational control over her body, rational control over her mind. And that lack of rational control is something which makes her perhaps empathetically connected to this young woman who's studying to be a doctor. And that's a very important figure, this young woman studying to be a doctor, the young woman who wants to become a medical officer. And how does an existential complexity like this person, Rukmini, appear to someone who is training to be a doctor, is something which the story seems to look at quite closely. So she would sit in her corner, her round plump face reddening, giggling like a little girl. I knew better than ask her why. I was a teenager by then, but some uninitiated friend would be unable to resist and would go up to my great-grandmother and ask her why she was laughing. This, I knew, would send her into uncontrollable peals. The tears would flow down her cheeks, and finally, catching her breath, still weak with laughter, she would confess. She would fart exactly like a train whistling its way out of the station, and give her as much joy as a child would get when she saw or heard a train. So perhaps it was not at all surprising that she could be flippant about her only child's death, especially since 10 years had passed. So you find the different bodily functions described over here are interesting, because the whole idea of this old woman farting and giggling and and producing sound which is exactly like the train whistle is interesting, because the whistling train to her becomes an image of aspiration, becomes an image of astonishment, an image of joy. And that whole viscerality about her identity, the whole messy viscerality about her identity, perhaps accounts for the fact that she gets some degree of flippant pleasure or flippant humor about the fact that her only child, died 10 years ago, and she continues to live, and now she's 90 years old. So what is interesting is to see the very messy corporeality in this body, the very messy idea of the body, the unpredictable, mutable messiness, which defines the corporeality of this particular woman, and how that kind of corporeality informs the identity, especially in a particularly discursive space such as the Tamil Brahmin household, where certain food are restricted, certain food are not allowed. And that kind of a discursive mapping is interesting because it's against the backdrop of this discursive mapping that we see this idea of flippant disregard, this messy viscerality producing its own articulations, which can be sometimes subversive in quality. But the point is, this is a woman who's not really steadily subversive. This is a woman who's just messy and anarchic in the way that her body functions. And the functionality of the body is interesting over here because that's what informs her identity in a big way. Right. So we are told that whenever someone asks her why is she laughing, she would first produce farting, and then she would go flippant as a child, talking about the death of her own child, and this is what she would say thereafter. Yes, Ratna, you study hard and become a big doctor, madam. She would chuckle when I kept the lights on all nights and pace up and down the room, reading to myself. So she would chuckle almost amusingly to looking at Ratna, who now we know is the protagonist of the story, and tell her to be a good doctor, madam, in a slightly sarcastic way. So the ring of sarcasm is quite clearly there in her voice. And the word chuckle seems to suggest that as well. The last time I saw a doctor, I was 30 years old. Your grandfather was in hospital for 3 months. He would faint every time he saw his own blood. So and the whole idea of the father figure or the husband figure fainting at the sight of his own blood is something which amuses her now after so many years. And she says, the last time I was in hospital when I was 30 years old, so that must have been 60 years ago. And that is something that she still remembers quite clearly. And so we find what is medically known as retrograde amnesia, where someone remembers something which happened to them many, many years ago, while at the same time finding it difficult or struggling to remember something which happened very recently. So that kind of memory is something which is very common in old people, especially when they become demented and decadent in a neural way. So the neural decadence manifests itself sometimes with retrograde amnesia, which is what seems to be happening over here. And as if that summed up the progress made between 2 generations, she would pull her blanket over her head and begin snoring almost immediately. I have 2 rooms, the entire downstairs to myself now since my great-grandmother died. I begin my course at medical college next month, and I'm afraid to be here alone all night. So we told again the spatial boundaries, spatial mapping of the house is laid out before us in this particular paragraph. I have to live up to the gold medal I won last year. I keep late hours reading my anatomy textbook before the course begins. The body is a solid, reliable thing. It is a wonderful, resilient machine. I hold on to the thick hardboard bound and flip through the new smelling page. Greedily, I stop every time I find an illustration and look at it closely. It reduces us to pink, blue, and white color-coded labeled parts. Muscles, veins, tendons. Everything has a name. Everything is linked one with the other, all parts of a functioning whole. So what we find over here, interestingly, is a medical gaze on the body. How is the body looked at, medically speaking, by a medical practitioner? And the whole idea of mapping the body is interesting because what that contrasts with immediately is the unmappable body, the unmappable viscerality of this particular person, this particular character, Rukmini. So the rational mapped gaze or mapping gaze of the body is contrasted with the unmappability of the viscerality, which determines Rukmini and her identities, at this point in time. And that difference, that contrast, is something which is very, very interestingly highlighted throughout the story. It is poor consolation for the nights I have spent in her warm bed, surrounded by that safe, familiar, musty smell. She was cheerful and never sick. But she was also undeniably old, and so it was no great surprise to us when she suddenly took to lying in bed all day a few weeks before her 90th birthday. So a few weeks before her 90th birthday, she just suddenly took to lying on the bed. And that lying on the bed, of course, becomes an interruption of a certain kind of embodiment. And she says, the protagonist over here, she's saying that, she had never been sick, but then at the same time, there seems to be some kind of anticipation in the mind of a certain kind of culmination coming, a certain kind of closure coming. And that anticipation perhaps makes her subversive in quality, knowing that she doesn't have a lot of time at her disposal. She had been lying in bed for close to 2 months, ignoring concern, advice, schooling, and then she suddenly gave up. She agreed to see a doctor. The young doctor came out of the room, his face puzzled and angry. My father begged him to sit down and drink a cup of hot coffee. She will need all kinds of tests, he announced. How long has she had that lump on her neck? How have you had it checked? So the young doctor, again, the word young is important. So the medical gaze over here seems to be young in quality, seems to be sort of naive in quality, and which is completely inadequate in terms of mapping the unmappable viscerality of this woman's body. And the unmappability of the woman's body is something which is very carefully contrasted with the young doctor, the young great-granddaughter, etc. And that is a contrast which runs throughout the story. But at the same time, the contrast at some point becomes a continuation, becomes a continuum, because we find later in the story that a young lady who's studying to be a doctor has a degree of empathetic connect, a dialogic relationship with his great-grandmother, who is ignorant, comes from a village and doesn't really have any aspiration in life. But then at the same time, that although the difference is so superficial and so spectacular, there seems to be some kind of a deep organic connect which the story establishes as it progresses. My father shifted uneasily in his cane chair. He is a cadaverous looking man, prone to nervousness and sweating. So the father figure over here is a very ghostly, sickly old man, cadaverous, is corpse-like, prone to nervousness and sweating. So not really a confident person, not really a person with conviction and a sense of security. He kept a big jar of antacids on his office desk. He has a 9-to-5 accountant's job in a company, or in a government-owned company, that kind that never fires his employees. So we find that there's a degree of security, or perhaps over hyper-security about his position. So he works in a government company which never fires his employees. Who wants to get a job, it's a secure job forever. However, we are also told that in his desk, the desk job that he does, in his desk, he carries a big jar of antacids on his left desk. So that big jar of antacids obviously anticipates or obviously means that he's someone who's afraid of acidity, afraid of being, afraid of falling ill. So maybe there's a degree of hypochondriac quality about this father character, which is again completely contrasting with the very stable and healthy womanly quality of this great-grandmother. So the healthy femininity, despite the age, seems to be much preferable compared to the unhealthy masculinity of the father over here. That is a contrast which plays very well throughout the story. The difference between the contrast between young age and old age, health and sickness, rationality and madness, etc. And we find at some point it's difficult to problematize, it's difficult not to problematize these binaries. These binaries become very, very messy in a way, which is then almost difficult to map out in terms of opposites, so ontological opposites. So she will lead all kinds of tests, he announced, he being a young doctor over here. How long has she had that lump on her neck? Have you had it checked? My father shifted uneasily in his cane chair. He is a cadaverous looking man, prone to nervousness and sweating, and we are told he keeps a big jar of antacids and he works in an office, a government office which never fires his employees. My father pulled out the small towel he uses in a place of a handkerchief. Wiping his forehead, he mumbled, "You know how these old women are, impossible to argue with them." The neck, the doctor said more gently, and I could see he pitied my father. I think it was examined before, once long ago. My father was alive then. This was supposed to be, there was supposed to be an operation, to have been an operation. But you know what they thought in those days, an operation meant an unnatural death. All the relatives came over to scare her, advise her with horror stories. And so she said, "No, you know how it is." And then she was already a widow. Then my father was head of the household. How could he, a 14-year-old, take the responsibility? So this is the grandchild, the grandson, telling the doctor of the account of her suffering. And what we get immediately is the fact that the original father figure of this particular story, the husband of this particular woman, is conspicuously absent, and we have the sons and grandsons taking care, or at least talking about her in very, very vigorous details. And so the whole idea of being reluctant to be operated is something which comes from a particular tradition, and she, we are told, refused to go to a hospital, and the refusal to go to a hospital obviously aggravated her condition, and then we are told that the son at that point in time, the son of this particular person, was 14 years old and could not take responsibility, could not be expected to take responsibility in a way which should be fulfilling. "Well," said the doctor, he shrugged his shoulders, "let me know when you want to admit her in my nursing home, but I suppose it's best to let her die at home." So this particular word is a bit of a getaway, really, because what has been told to us is the fact that this person would be best left to die. There'd be no medical possibility of making her survive, and the whole idea of letting her die makes her into some kind of a limbo state. And that is the point where there's a spatial temporal setting where the whole idea of subversion will begin, because she'll be lying on the bed, lying in her own house, surrounded by people that she knows. But in the final act of her life, she will start preparing an act of a narrative of subversion, which will go against all the customs and beliefs which had clamped her down over generations, over a period of time. When the doctor left, we looked at each other, the three of us, like shifty accomplices, accomplices. My mother, practical as always, broke the silence and said, let's not tell her anything. Why worry her? And then we'll have all kinds of difficult old aunts and cousins visiting. It'll be such a nuisance. How will Ratna study in the middle of the chaos? So Ratna being the category, the female category here, who's presumably preparing for the medical examination, the final examination, and we're told that she's a very good student, that she won the gold medal the previous year, and she wants to replicate that achievement this year as well. So the mother, which is the granddaughter of Rukmini, she breaks the silence and says, we shouldn't tell her anything because she's quite old already. And then the whole point is to avoid people visiting her, to avoid people paying visit to her in terms of seeing her before she dies. And the immediate concern is, how will Ratna study in the middle of all such chaos? So we find Ratna's priorities over here become important, and the age of Ratna, someone who's about to enter the cusp of womanhood from girlhood, becomes a very symbolic age, and she's obviously again on the cusp of becoming a doctor, from being someone of the house to becoming a public person. And that liminality between age, liminality between ages, liminality between two different positions in society is something which is very much a part of the story, because what happens thereafter, we find that Rukmini, the great-grandmother, she will lie on the bed and she will demand to be fed certain things which were disallowed to her all her life. And that liminality of lying in the bed, doing things which are not allowed to her, becomes very much part of the story. And that gets related to the issue of agency in the story. How does agency manifest itself in an embodied way? How does agency manifest itself through markers of food, markers of materiality, etc.? So that's something we'll continue with the next lecture, but we'll conclude at this point today, and we'll move on and hopefully finish up this text in the next couple of lectures to come. Thank you for your attention.